Imagine you are a British cavalry commander. It's January of 1781, and you're commanding some of the most elite, battle-hardened infantry on the face of the planet.
Right, the absolute best of the best.
Exactly. So you've just force-marched your men through the freezing dark of a South Carolina night. You emerge into this open cow pasture right at dawn, and right in front of you, the opposing American militia fires a ragged volley, turns their backs, and just runs in pure, unadulterated panic.
Which is, exactly what you'd expect them to do.
Right. So you order the general charge to finish them off, totally convinced you've just secured another glorious victory for the crown. But you don't realize it yet, but you haven't won anything.
Not even close.
Yeah. You have just walked into a geographical meat grinder engineered by a man who predicted your exact psychological reaction. And in less than 60 minutes, your entire command will cease to exist.
It's the ultimate fatal illusion, really. I mean, you see what you want to see, a routing enemy, and you completely miss the snare closing around your own ankles.
It's just wild.
It is. Welcome to our deep dive into the Battle of Cowpens. We're going to explore a single hour of violence in the southern backcountry that fundamentally dismantled British strategic capabilities in the American War of Independence, and it literally paved the direct road to the surrender at Yorktown.
Yeah, and to pull all this apart for you today, we are leaning heavily on an incredibly rigorous research study authored by Mick Crichter. You can actually find it over at battlefieldtravels.com.
And it is a fantastic resource.
Oh, it's incredible. The reason we're using this specific source for our deep dive is that Crichter doesn't just, recycle old textbook summaries. He builds his analysis from the ground up using primary source letters, direct topographical exploration of the physical battlefield, and advanced GIS, geographic information systems, terrain analysis.
Yeah, and that GIS component is just crucial for understanding the specific engagement. I mean, standard 18th century maps or even modern flat topographies, they just can't show you the microterrain.
Right, the stuff you only see when you're standing there.
Exactly. The subtle 2-foot dips and the blind ridges that an infantry commander actually uses to hide his men. So Crichter's use of modern satellite and elevation data layered right over historical positions, it allows us to see the exact sightlines. We get to look through the eyes of the commanders and see how the very dirt of South Carolina was weaponized.
It's fascinating.
Okay.
But before we get into the dirt of that cow pasture, we really have to establish why a major British military expedition is hunting a detached American column through the woods of South Carolina in the first place.
Right. We need to set the board.
Yeah. So let's look at the strategic board at the end of 1780. If I'm looking at the Northern Theater, places like New York and Pennsylvania, the war seems, completely paralyzed.
Paralyzed is exactly the right word. George Washington's Continental Army and Sir Henry Clinton's British forces were essentially locked in this massive standoff around New York.
Just staring each other down.
Pretty much. The British could hold the coastal cities where the Royal Navy could supply them, but every time they marched into the interior, they bled out. And furthermore, by 1780, the French had officially entered the war.
Which changes everything.
Completely. The British High Command in London suddenly realized they were no longer just fighting a colonial rebellion. They were fighting a global war against another superpower. They needed a game changer.
Right. So the British look south. They look at Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia. And, the assumption in London was that the southern colonies were heavily populated by loyalists.
Yeah, people who still wanted the king's rule.
Right, people who were just waiting for British army to show up so they could take up arms against the Patriot rebels.
It was essentially an economy of force strategy. I mean, the British military was stretched incredibly thin globally. They just couldn't afford to send another 50,000 regulars to America.
So they had to get creative.
Right. So the theory was shift the theater to the south, capture a major port, establish a foothold, and then let the local loyalist militias do the heavy lifting of occupying the interior.
Wow. Let the locals fight it out.
Exactly. They wanted to turn the conflict into a localized civil war where the crown forces merely acted as the vanguard.
And for a brief, terrifying moment for the Americans, that strategy looked like an unstoppable juggernaut. I mean, in May of 1780, the British pulled off a massive operational success. General Sir Henry Clinton besieged and captured Charleston, South Carolina.
Yeah, that was devastating.
We aren't just talking about taking a city. We are talking about the surrender of over 5,000 American troops.
The loss of Charleston was a catastrophic logistical and psychological blow. I mean, it was the single largest surrender of American forces in the entire war. The whole Southern Continental Army was essentially wiped off the map in a single stroke.
I have to ask about the aftermath of that, though. I mean, if you lose your entire army in May, how do you even fight a war in August?
Well, you scramble.
Right. I know the Continental Congress scrambled and sent Horatio Gates down south to build a new army. And this is a guy who took credit for winning the Battle of Saratoga, so he has this massive reputation.
He had the reputation, sure, but he completely lacked the operational caution required in the South. So in August 1780, at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina, Gates pushed his newly formed, half-starved army of mostly raw militia right into the teeth of an elite British force commanded by General Charles Cornwallis.
And that didn't go well.
It wasn't just a defeat, it was a complete rout. The American militia broke almost immediately, and Horatio Gates himself actually fled the battlefield on horseback, riding nearly 60 miles away before nightfall.
60 miles. Wow, so within 3 months, the British have destroyed 2 entire American armies in the South. Cornwallis must be sitting in his headquarters thinking the war is functionally over, like he's pacified the South.
That is precisely what Cornwallis reported back to London, but the pacification was entirely superficial.
How so?
Well, the British strategy hinged on raising those local loyalist militias to secure the backcountry, but the way those loyalists were utilized and the sheer brutality of the British provincial commanders, it sparked a terrifying backlash.
It got ugly.
Extremely ugly. This wasn't a gentleman's war in the South. It was a vicious, bloody, neighbor against neighbor civil war. Homes were burned, prisoners were executed, and parole agreements were just blatantly violated.
Which brings us to a crucial breaking point right before Cowpens, which is the Battle of Kings Mountain in October 1780. The British send a loyalist force under Major Patrick Ferguson into the Western Mountains to threaten the frontier settlers, right?
Yes. And Ferguson issues this incredibly arrogant decree. He tells the frontiersmen to lay down their arms or he will march over the mountains and hang their leaders.
Which is just like poking a hornet's nest.
Oh, it was a catastrophic miscalculation of frontier psychology. Instead of intimidating the settlers, it absolutely infuriated them.
Yeah.
These over-mountain men, these hardened frontiersmen from what is now Tennessee and North Carolina, they didn't wait for Ferguson to come to them. They formed a localized militia, tracked Ferguson down at Kings Mountain, and completely annihilated his force.
Wow.
Yeah. They killed Ferguson and killed or captured his entire command of over 1,000 loyalists.
That seems like a massive strategic warning flare for Cornwallis, doesn't it? Like, it proves that the British supply lines and loyalist auxiliaries are incredibly vulnerable the further inland they go.
It was a warning flare that Cornwallis severely underestimated. I mean, Kings Mountain destroyed the loyalist momentum in the Carolinas. It meant that Cornwallis could no longer rely on locals to guard his flanks.
So he's exposed.
Exactly. If he wanted to move his regular army north into North Carolina and Virginia, he was going to have to drag his vulnerable supply lines through incredibly hostile territory.
And into this volatile, blood-soaked theater steps a new American commander in December 1780, General Nathaniel Greene. George Washington specifically handpicks Greene to salvage the disaster in the South. And Greene arrives in North Carolina, takes command of the ragged, starving remnants of the Southern Army, and immediately makes a decision that violates every conventional military doctrine of the era. He divides his smaller army in the face of a vastly superior enemy.
Yeah, from a purely Clausewitzian or Germanian perspective of massing your forces, dividing a vastly outnumbered, undersupplied army is professional suicide.
It sounds crazy.
It does. You are basically offering the enemy the chance to destroy you in detail. But Greene wasn't fighting a conventional European war. He was fighting a war of logistical geometry.
Okay, let me stop you there because the geometry is what I really want to unpack here.
Yeah.
If I am Nathaniel Greene, I have maybe 2,000 effective troops. Cornwallis has over 4,000 highly trained regulars. If I split my 2,000 men into 2 groups of 1,000, why doesn't Cornwallis just march his 4,000 men directly at one of my halves, obliterate it, and then turn around and obliterate the other? Like, why doesn't he just do that? It reminds me of a naval commander splitting a smaller fleet to force a larger armada into the treacherous, shallow waters where their massive size actually becomes a liability. Is it like that?
That is a phenomenal analogy, actually, yes. It all comes down to the logistical realities of the Carolina backcountry. It is this massive expanse of dense pine forests, deep mud, and unfordable river systems, like the PD, the Catawba, and the Broad Rivers.
Ah, so it's a terrain issue.
Exactly. To move an army of 4,000 men, Cornwallis requires a massive baggage train of food, ammunition, and fodder for the horses. He can only move as fast as his slowest wagon.
Which isn't very fast.
Not at all. Greene understood this. By sending Brigadier General Daniel Morgan westward with a highly mobile column of light troops, Greene created a severe dilemma for the British.
Oh, I see. So Morgan is now positioned to the west, where he can threaten the British outposts, rally the local patriot militias, and basically just tear up Cornwallis's fragile supply lines. And Greene takes the other half of the army to the east, so Cornwallis is caught in the middle.
Precisely. Cornwallis cannot march his slow, massive main army west to chase Morgan because Greene would sweep down and recapture Charleston.
Right.
But he also cannot ignore Morgan because Morgan is actively destroying his left flank and his supply chain. Greene's division of forces forced Cornwallis to divide his own forces in response.
So Cornwallis realizes he has to amputate this threat on his flank.
Hmm.
He detaches a flying column, a fast, highly mobile strike force to hunt down Daniel Morgan, which means this entire strategic chess match suddenly funnels down into a deeply personal collision between the two men commanding these separated columns.
Yes. And the personalities of these two commanders are, well, they're the entire operational fulcrum of this deep dive.
Let's talk about them.
So, the hunter dispatched by Cornwallis is Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton. Tarleton commands the British Legion. He is young, in his mid-20s, incredibly ambitious, and completely ruthless.
Now, for you listening who have seen the year 2000 film The Patriot, Tarleton is the direct historical basis for the character Colonel William Tavington. Now, the movie obviously Hollywoodizes him into an outright cartoon villain burning down occupied churches. But the real Tarleton's reputation wasn't exactly sterling, was it?
No, his reputation was built on extreme aggression and a total disregard for the conventional restraint of the era.
How so?
Well, Tarleton's force, the British Legion, was a mixed unit of light cavalry and light infantry. They wore green jackets instead of the traditional British red, and they were designed for rapid pursuit and shock action.
Right, the flying column.
Exactly. And Tarleton became infamous after the Battle of Waxhaws earlier in 1780, where his cavalry charged a retreating American force and continued to hack them down with sabers even after they tried to surrender.
Oh, wow. That's brutal.
It was. It became known as Tarleton's quarter, meaning he gave no quarter.
So if you are an American militiaman, Banastre Tarleton is the boogeyman. You know that if he catches you, he won't just defeat you, he will slaughter you.
Exactly. Tarleton weaponized terror. His operational philosophy was that American militias were inherently cowardly and undisciplined. He truly believed that if he could just get his cavalry into contact with them, the mere sight of his charging sabers would cause a total psychological collapse.
Just overwhelming them with fear.
Right. He relied on momentum, shock, and awe.
And that brings us to the man Cornwallis has sent him to hunt, American Brigadier General Daniel Morgan. And Morgan is practically the biological opposite of Tarleton, right? He is not some polished, Oxford-educated aristocrat.
No, not at all. Morgan is a frontier brawler. He is a massive, physically imposing man who started his military career not as an officer, but as a wagon driver during the French and Indian War.
A wagon driver.
Yeah. He actually bore the scars on his back from receiving 499 lashes from a British military tribunal in his youth for punching a British officer.
499 lashes. That's insane.
It is. So Morgan understood the brutal, visceral reality of combat from the bottom up.
And crucially, he has an incredible combat record. I mean, he fought in the freezing siege of Quebec. He was one of the absolute heroes of the Battle of Saratoga, commanding a unit of elite riflemen.
Yeah, and what separated Morgan from almost every other American commander of the war was his profound understanding of human psychology under fire.
How did that differ from the others?
Well, most regular Army officers, both British and American, viewed militia with total disdain. They expected them to fight like trained European regulars, standing shoulder to shoulder in an open field, exchanging musket volleys at 50 yards, and then curse them when they inevitably broke and ran from professional bayonet charges.
But Morgan looks at the militia differently. He knows they are farmers, tradesmen, fathers. They don't have bayonets. They don't have years of drill. But they do know how to shoot.
Right. Morgan knew exactly what a Continental regular could do, and he knew exactly what a raw militiaman would do. Tarleton expected the militia to break. Morgan planned for the militia to break, but he planned to choreograph that break on his own highly controlled terms.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Like, Tarleton's overconfidence was a known variable that Morgan actively weaponized. I mean, is there a historical precedent where a commander perfectly predicted an arrogant opponent's exact path of attack like this?
It's rare, but yes, it happens when one commander understands his enemy's ego. And Morgan read Tarleton perfectly.
So Tarleton is driving his men to the point of exhaustion, pushing through the Carolina mud, desperate to catch Morgan. And Morgan has a choice. He can keep running, try to cross the flooded Broad River, and risk getting caught while his men are bottlenecked at the riverbank. Or he can turn and fight.
And he decides to turn.
Right. He chooses a piece of ground known as Hannah's Cowpens. So let's dig into the terrain analysis from the Prichter study here. What exactly is a cowpens in 1781?
It's exactly what it sounds like. It was a well-known local landmark where cattle drivers would rest and graze their herds before taking them to market. It was an open, sparsely wooded pasture roughly 500 yards long. The underbrush had basically been cleared out by the grazing cattle, making it relatively open ground.
Wait, open ground. But if Tarleton's entire advantage is based on his terrifying cavalry, why on earth would Morgan choose a flat, open field? Isn't that playing directly into the British strengths?
On a macro level, yeah, it appears that way, and that is exactly what Morgan wanted Tarleton to think. But this is where the GIS microterrain analysis from Prichter becomes critical.
Ah, the microterrain.
Right. Hannah's Cowpens was not a flat billiard table. The field was flanked by deep, swampy creek lines on the left and right. This acted as a natural funnel. If a force attacked up the center, the creeks prevented them from easily swinging wide to flank the defenders.
Oh, that makes sense. It's almost like the Spartan defense at Thermopylae.
Yeah.
Using the geography to narrow the front so numerical superiority matters less.
Exactly. And furthermore, the field itself had a subtle, rolling topography. There were two distinct, gentle ridges with what military tacticians call dead ground between them.
What's dead ground?
Dead ground is a topographical depression where troops can be positioned so that they're completely invisible to an enemy approaching from the front. You literally cannot see them until you crest the ridge right on top of them.
Okay, that makes sense for the infantry. But I read in the study that Morgan deployed his forces with the flooded Broad River roughly 5 miles to his rear. That violates another massive rule of warfare, right? You never fight with a river at your back, because if you're defeated, your army is trapped and annihilated. Did Morgan just make a mistake there?
No, it was a highly calculated psychological decision. Morgan understood his militia. If he gave them an open road or a deep forest to retreat into, they might just keep running all the way home.
Right, flight instinct.
Exactly. So by putting the river to their rear and deliberately leaving their horses tied up near the riverbank, Morgan essentially told his men, "You cannot outrun Tarleton's cavalry. If you break and run now, you will be cut down before you reach the water. Your only chance of survival is to stand and fight together."
Wow. He engineered a situation where their self-preservation instinct was tethered entirely to the success of his tactical plan. That is incredibly cold, but brilliant.
It was pragmatic survival.
So let's look at the pieces Morgan has on this chessboard. He has roughly 1,000 men. Who are they?
His core, his anchor, consists of about 300 to 350 Continentals. These are regular professional soldiers from Maryland and Delaware, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard.
And these guys are good.
Oh, the Maryland line was widely considered some of the finest, most disciplined infantry in the world at that time. They had bayonets, and they absolutely knew how to use them.
Okay. Then he has the bulk of his force, which is 500 to 600 militia from the Carolinas and Georgia under the command of Andrew Pickens. He also has a vital cavalry reserve of roughly 80 to 100 dragoons under Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, who, interestingly, was a second cousin to George Washington.
Right. And finally, he has small, elite groups of frontier riflemen, men who brought their own personal hunting weapons to the fight.
Now let's look at the British column tearing up the road behind them. Tarleton has roughly 1,150 men, so the numbers are relatively even, maybe a slight edge to the British, but the quality of the troops on paper isn't even close, is it?
Not at all. Tarleton has absolute elite regulars. He has the 7th Regiment of Foot, also known as the Royal Fusiliers. He has a battalion of the 71st Highlanders who were feared shock troops. He has the regular infantry of his own British Legion.
That's a heavy lineup.
It is. He also brings 250 to 300 light cavalry. And critically, he has artillery. 2 3-pounder field guns, known as grasshoppers, because of how they jumped when they fired.
I want to focus on those cannons for a second, because I think modern audiences hear 3-pounder and think of a tiny, insignificant weapon. But in 18th century linear combat, what does a 3-pound solid iron ball actually do when fired into a line of men?
It is a devastating kinetic weapon. It doesn't explode like a modern artillery shell. It is a solid iron sphere fired at near supersonic speeds. It is designed to skip across the hard ground like a stone skipping across water.
Oof, that sounds terrifying.
It is. If a tight formation of men is standing shoulder to shoulder, a single 3-pound ball can tear through an entire file of 10 or 15 men, severing limbs and shattering torsos before it loses momentum.
Wow.
Yeah. It inflicts horrific physical damage, but more importantly, it inflicts massive psychological trauma on the men who have to stand in line and watch it happen.
So Tarleton has the cannons, the superior cavalry numbers, and the elite bayonet-wielding infantry. Morgan knows he cannot fight a standard toe-to-toe linear battle. So let's walk through exactly how Morgan deploys his troops in this layered defense to spring the trap. It's like a commander setting up a false front line in trench warfare to absorb the initial artillery barrage, right?
That's a great way to picture it, yes. So it is the night of January 16th. The Americans are camped at the Cowpens, and the night before the battle is crucial. Morgan didn't just sleep in his tent.
What did he do?
He spent the entire night walking among the campfires of the militia. He joked with them, he showed them his flogging scars to prove his hatred of the British, and he explicitly explained his battle plan to them. He told them exactly what to expect and what he needed them to do. He removed the fear of the unknown.
And as dawn breaks on January 17th, 1781, Tarleton arrives at the edge of the Cowpens. His men have been marching since 0400 hours through muddy, freezing roads. They are exhausted. They haven't had breakfast. But Tarleton, seeing the Americans formed up in the open, decides to attack immediately.
Right, he relies on shock.
Which initiates phase 1 and 2 of the battle, the skirmish line. Morgan does not just wait for the British to march up. He sends his riflemen forward.
The riflemen are dispersed behind trees and brush far out in front of the main American line. And this is where we have to explain the mechanics of the weaponry. The standard British soldier carried a Brown Bess smoothbore musket.
Which is pretty inaccurate.
Very. It fired a large, heavy lead ball, but the barrel had no grooves. The ball rattled down the barrel and flew out with terrible accuracy. A trained British soldier could load and fire 3 or 4 times a minute, but they were effectively firing a wall of lead in a general direction, hoping to hit something within 50 to 80 yards.
But the American long rifle is completely different technology.
Yes. The rifle has spiral grooves cut into the inside of the barrel. When the lead ball is rammed down with a greased patch, those grooves impart a spin on the bullet, exactly like a perfectly thrown football.
Gyroscopic stabilization.
Exactly. This stabilization means a skilled frontiersman could hit a man-sized target at over 200 yards. The trade-off is that the rifle takes a full minute to reload, and it cannot equip a bayonet.
So these riflemen are hidden behind trees. They outranged the British muskets by a massive margin. And Morgan gave them very specific targets, right? They aren't just shooting randomly into the redcoats.
Morgan told them to look for the epaulets. They specifically targeted British officers, sergeants, and the artillerymen managing the 3-pounder guns. As Tarleton's infantry begins to form their lines in advance, suddenly their lieutenants and captains are dropping dead from unseen shooters hundreds of yards away.
In an 18th century army, that is catastrophic. The soldiers are trained to blindly follow the orders of the officer standing right next to them. If the officer goes down, the formation loses cohesion.
It seeds massive chaos right out of the gate. But the riflemen know they cannot stand against a bayonet charge. So having fired a few devastating, highly targeted volleys, the riflemen follow Morgan's orders. They fall back, melting into the woods and retreating behind the next layer of American defense.
Tarleton is watching this from his horse. What goes through his mind? I mean, he sees the American skirmishers take a few shots and then turn and run.
It confirms every arrogant bias Tarleton possesses. He interprets a planned, disciplined withdrawal as the beginning of a panicked rout. He thinks the rebels are already breaking.
He's fallen right into it.
Completely.
Yeah.
He orders his infantry to advance at the quick step. The drums beat, the colors are flying, and the British main line marches forward into the pasture.
Which brings us to phase 3, The British regular infantry marches up the gentle slope, and they suddenly come face to face with the second layer of Morgan's defense, Andrew Pickens and the Carolina militia.
And here is where Morgan's psychological brilliance truly manifests. He did not ask the militia to fight a pitched battle against British regulars. That would be impossible. He asked them for one very specific, terrifying task.
What was it?
He told them, wait until the British are 50 yards away, fire 2 volleys, and then you have my permission to turn around and run.
That is the part I find hardest to comprehend. You are a farmer from South Carolina. You are standing in an open field. A line of 800 British regulars is marching towards you with bayonets fixed. You have to stand perfectly still and watch them get closer and closer and closer until you can literally see their facial features. How do you not break and run immediately?
Because Morgan removed the psychological trap of having to fight to the death. By explicitly giving them permission to retreat after 2 shots, he removed the panic. They knew they had a planned escape route. They just had to hold their nerve for 2 pulls of the trigger.
Wow. So what does this all mean? It reminds me of the discipline required at Bunker Hill. The famous command, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. But this time, it's paired with a pre-planned escape route that completely changes the tactical dynamic.
It's exactly like that, but with a built-in safety valve.
Right. So the British march to the 50-yard line. Pickens gives the order. The militia fires their first volley. 500 muskets erupt simultaneously.
And the physical impact is staggering. A volley of that size at 50 yards tears massive holes in the British line. Entire files of men drop dead or wounded. The British advance physically staggers. They halt, they dress their lines, and they prepare to fire back.
And while they do that,
right as they do, the militia reloads and fires their second volley at point-blank range, just as the British are preparing to charge.
And then, true to their orders, the militia turn and sprint away. They break to the left and right, funneling behind the main line of American Continentals who are hidden further up the hill.
And once again, Tarleton completely misreads the tactical reality. He has taken horrific casualties from those 2 volleys. A massive percentage of his officers are dead or wounded. But through the blinding white smoke of the black powder, he sees the entire American militia turn their backs and flee.
So he smells blood in the water. He thinks he has shattered the American center. He throws all caution to the wind and commits everything he has. He genuinely thinks this is a mop-up operation.
This moves us into Phase 4. Tarleton sends the 17th Light Dragoons, his elite cavalry, charging forward to ride down the fleeing militia. This was standard operating procedure. Cavalry was designed to slaughter disorganized, retreating infantry before they could reform.
But Morgan saw this coming too. The militias are running, the British sabers are bearing down on them, and suddenly, out from behind the American lines, Lieutenant Colonel William Washington's American cavalry emerges.
Right. Washington's dragoons had been kept hidden in reserve specifically for this moment. They charge headlong into the British cavalry. A massive, swirling saber melee erupts on the flank.
Just absolute chaos.
Total chaos. The British cavalry, disorganized by their pursuit, is completely shattered by Washington's concentrated countercharge. The British dragoons are driven from the field, and the American militia is saved.
That eliminates Tarleton's cavalry screen on that side of the field. But the real crisis of the battle is happening right in the center. Tarleton's infantry, having absorbed the militia volleys, finally crests that subtle topographical ridge in the middle of the Cowpens.
Yeah.
And what they see must have frozen their blood.
Oh, absolutely. They expect to see empty ground and fleeing backs. Instead, waiting for them in the topographical depression, perfectly rested in a rigid, disciplined line, are John Eager Howard's Maryland and Delaware Continentals.
The veterans.
The veterans. They level their muskets and fire a devastating disciplined volley right into the faces of the exhausted British.
The British and the Continentals lock into a brutal, close-range firefight. The noise is deafening. The smoke is so thick you can't see the man next to you. And this is where the fog of war intervenes. Tarleton's 71st Highlanders swing wide to try and outflank the American right. Howard, the Continental commander, sees the Highlanders trying to turn his flank. He orders his rightmost company to refuse the flank, which means to wheel backward to face the new threat.
It is a really complex maneuver to execute under heavy fire, and in the roar of the musketry, the shouty commands and the drum beats get confused. The right company turns around to march backward. The adjacent company sees them turn and assumes a general withdrawal has been ordered.
I don't know.
Yeah. Within seconds, the entire Continental line turns its back to the British and begins to march away up the hill.
Wait, if I am a Continental soldier and the guys next to me turn and walk away, I'm absolutely going with them. The contagion of retreat is impossible to stop.
Hmm.
This looks like the entire American army is disintegrating.
That is exactly how Tarleton views it. He sees the elite Continentals turning their backs. He assumes he has broken the final layer of defense. He orders his men to charge with the bayonet.
But his men are spent.
Right, because the British are exhausted, and because so many of their officers are dead, the British charge is totally disorganized. It loses all linear cohesion. It just becomes a wild, screaming mob of redcoats sprinting forward for the kill.
This reminds me of like a planned tactical withdrawal in armored warfare that inadvertently pulls enemy tanks out of their defensive dugouts into a crossfire.
It's an accident.
But it creates the perfect setup because the Continentals aren't running in a panic, right? They are marching away in disciplined step.
Yes. Howard realizes what has happened, but he doesn't panic. He rides his horse out in front of his retreating men. Morgan rides up to him, points to a spot on the ground just a few dozen yards away, and says, "When you reach that line, face about and fire."
Man. So they let the screaming mass of disorganized British infantry get within 30 yards. 30 yards.
And then Howard barks the command. The Continentals halt, they spin on their heels, they level their muskets, and they fire a massive point-blank volley straight into the disorganized mass of the British charge.
The shock must have been absolutely paralyzing. The British are mid-stride, weapons lowered, thinking they are chasing a fleeing enemy, and suddenly a wall of lead just obliterates their front ranks.
The physical momentum of the British army simply collapses. And this is Phase 5. Morgan recognizes the precise, fleeting moment when the British psychological breaking point is reached. He orders a general all-out counterattack.
Howard's Continentals lower their bayonets and charge directly into the stunned British center. But that isn't all. Washington's cavalry, having dealt with the British dragoon, wheels around and smashes into Tarleton's exposed left flank.
And remember the militia? The guys who fired their 2 shots and ran away?
Right, where are they?
Well, Andrew Pickens had spent the last 20 minutes safely reorganizing them in the woods behind the lines. Because they were safe, and because they saw the cavalry protecting them, they reformed their ranks. And right at this critical moment, the militia marches back onto the field and slams into the British right flank.
It is a perfect tactical nightmare for Tarleton. The Continentals hit the center. The cavalry hits the left. The militia hits the right.
What Daniel Morgan executes in that moment is known in military terminology as a double envelopment. It is the holy grail of battlefield tactics. It is exactly what Hannibal Barca did to the massive Roman army at the Battle of Cannae.
Oh, wow.
It is what the Zulu forces executed at the Battle of Isandlwana. The American forces acted as the horns of a buffalo, encircling the overextended, exhausted British center from all sides simultaneously.
The trap is entirely snapped shut. The British line doesn't just retreat, it completely dissolves into terror. The Highlanders on the British right flank, to their credit, form a tight circle and fight stubbornly, but they are entirely surrounded and eventually overwhelmed. Panic spreads like a virus. Elite British regulars throw down their weapons and surrender to the very militia they had despised an hour ago.
It's astounding. In the span of less than 60 minutes, Banastre Tarleton's feared flying column ceased to exist as a fighting force. The butcher's bill is completely staggering. Out of Tarleton's 1,150 troops, over 800 are killed, wounded, or captured. Tarleton loses his elite infantry. He loses his 2 field guns. He loses his entire baggage train.
And Morgan's casualties.
Morgan suffered roughly 25 men killed and roughly 120 wounded.
25 killed to destroy an entire British army column. That ratio utterly shatters the conventional wisdom of the era that British regulars were invincible in an open field. I mean, it just pushes back completely on that idea.
It definitely proved that American forces, properly coordinated, could obliterate elite British regulars in a stand-up fight.
And right as the British command is collapsing, we get this incredibly cinematic moment that highlights the sheer desperation of the defeat. Tarleton realizes the battle is lost. He manages to rally a small handful of his personal cavalry guard to try and salvage the artillery, but they refuse to fight. He turns to flee down the road.
Yeah, as Tarleton is attempting to escape, William Washington and a few American dragoons spot him and give chase. They ride out far ahead of their own lines, and it results in a literal chaotic saber duel on horseback between the 2 commanders.
Washington lunges at Tarleton, but Washington's saber actually snaps off at the hilt. He is completely defenseless. A British officer riding with Tarleton raises his sword to cut Washington down, but an American bugler riding behind Washington draws his pistol and shoots the British officer in the shoulder.
Tarleton himself then aims a pistol at Washington. He fires, misses Washington entirely, but hits Washington's horse. In the chaos of the melee, Tarleton turns his horse and gallops away down the muddy road, escaping the field with only about 40 of his original cavalrymen.
The feared hunter becomes the desperate fleeing prey. I look at that duel and the loss of Tarleton's cavalry, and I immediately wonder about the strategic ramifications. Tarleton losing his entire infantry force is devastating, obviously. But the loss of his dragoons, the cavalry, what does that do to Lord Cornwallis and the main British army?
It completely blinds him. You really cannot overstate the operational paralysis that occurs when an 18th century army loses its light cavalry. The cavalry are the eyes and ears of the army. They forage for food, they screen the infantry from surprise attacks, and they locate the enemy. By annihilating Tarleton's legion, Morgan essentially poked out Cornwallis's eyes.
Which brings us to the strategic aftershock of this single hour in a cow pasture. Cornwallis is encamped roughly 30 miles away when he receives the news that his elite strike force has been wiped off the map. How does he react? Like a wounded predator blindly chasing its prey into a snare.
That's exactly it. He reacts with absolute fury, and that fury overrides his strategic judgment. Cornwallis becomes completely obsessed with catching Daniel Morgan and recapturing the hundreds of British prisoners. Morgan is now marching north.
He just loses his strategic patience.
He does. But Morgan has a massive head start, and Cornwallis's army is weighed down by those massive logistical baggage trains we talked about earlier. So Cornwallis makes a decision that borders on madness.
What does he do?
To increase the speed of his pursuit, Cornwallis orders his army to halt for 2 days. He forces his men to pile up almost all of their tents, their extra clothing, their rum rations, and their excess food, and he sets it all on fire. He burns his own supply train so his army can move as fast as light infantry. That is logistical suicide. He is voluntarily severing his army from its own survival mechanisms just to move faster.
It is the ultimate testament to the psychological damage Cowpens inflicted. Cornwallis embarks on what becomes known as the Race to the Dan, a grueling, freezing pursuit across the flooded river systems of North Carolina, trying to catch Greene and Morgan.
It sounds miserable.
It was. Greene brilliantly leads Cornwallis on a wild goose chase, dragging the British further and further from their supply bases on the coast.
So Cornwallis's men are starving. They are marching barefoot in the freezing rain. They are completely exhausting themselves just to stay on the Americans' heels.
And when Greene finally decides to stop running and fight at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse 2 months later, Cornwallis's army is a hollowed-out shell of itself. At Guilford Courthouse, Nathaniel Greene essentially scales up Morgan's Cowpens tactical model. He uses the exact same layered defense, putting the militia in the front to fire volleys and fall back, bleeding the British as they advance.
The British technically hold the field at Guilford Courthouse, but it is a Pyrrhic victory, right? They lose a quarter of their remaining army. They are so battered and starved that Cornwallis is forced to abandon the interior of the Carolinas entirely.
Yes. He has to retreat to the coast at Wilmington to try and resupply from the Royal Navy. From there, lacking any other viable strategic options in the South, he decides to march his battered army north into Virginia, eventually settling into a little deep-water port town to wait for reinforcements.
A town called Yorktown.
A town called Yorktown, where he is subsequently trapped by the arrival of the French fleet and besieged by George Washington's combined American and French army, leading to the surrender that effectively wins the American War of Independence.
It's incredible.
It is. You can trace a direct, unbroken causal line from the destruction of Tarleton's cavalry in his South Carolina cow pasture directly to the final British surrender at Yorktown.
That is why Cowpens is not just a skirmish. It is the tactical linchpin of the entire Southern campaign. But, to truly comprehend the sheer audacity of what Daniel Morgan achieved, it requires moving beyond the map and actually observing the physical space. This is where McPrictor's emphasis on battlefield exploration is so vital.
Oh, absolutely. Today, the site of the battle is beautifully preserved as the Cowpens National Battlefield, maintained by the U.S. National Park Service. And what strikes visitors immediately when they arrive is the compact intimacy of the park.
That is a critical observation. If you go to a battlefield like Gettysburg, you are confronted with a sprawling, massive landscape that stretches for miles. It takes days to comprehend the sweeping movements of those armies. But Cowpens is intimate. You can stand at the visitor center and look across the entire operational space.
Right. You can walk the 1.25-mile battlefield trail that loops right through the center of the action. And this is where the physical landscape becomes the ultimate primary source. You can stand on the exact ground where the Carolina militia waited. You can turn around and look back at the topographical depression where John Eager Howard hid his Maryland Continentals.
When you stand in that dead ground, you physically realize what Prichter's GIS analysis proves on paper.
Yeah.
You look forward, and the subtle rise of the terrain completely blocks your view of the approaching British positions. You realize that Tarleton genuinely could not see the trap.
It really is something else. It's chilling to stand exactly where Morgan stood, to look down the natural funnel created by the creek beds on the left and right, and realize that the landscape itself is deadly.
Bringing this to life. The visitor center has detailed exhibits on the commanders, the period weapons, and the uniforms.
They also regularly host living history events and musket firing demonstrations. For a modern audience, seeing a black powder musket fired is crucial. It replicates the blinding white smoke that instantly covers the field and the deafening concussive noise that made communication nearly impossible. It strips away the sterile chessboard view of military history and grounds it in sensory reality.
It reminds you that this brilliant tactical diagram was executed by tired, freezing, terrified, and incredibly courageous human beings standing in the mud. It transforms a brilliant theory into a visceral reality.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to consider regarding the nature of warfare and leadership. The Battle of Cowpens demonstrates that the perceived weakness of a military force, like an untrained, unreliable militia, can actually be transformed into a devastating tactical weapon.
The commander knows what to do with it.
Exactly. That transformation only happens if the commander understands the psychology of his enemy better than the enemy understands himself. It forces a lingering question. If Banastre Tarleton had simply suppressed his arrogance, if he had respected the militia enough to pause and send his cavalry to scout over that ridge instead of blindly charging, would Cornwallis's army have survived intact? Would Yorktown have ever happened?
It is a massive historical what-if that hinges entirely on the blinding arrogance of one man and the brilliant pragmatic psychology of another. And that is exactly where we will leave the exploration today. I want to explicitly acknowledge our foundational source material once again. We give full credit to Mick Prichter and his extensive phenomenal research that made this analysis possible. I highly encourage you to visit battlefieldtravels.com. You can dive into their advanced GIS mapping, access hundreds of other deeply detailed battle and campaign studies, and explore travel guides that will completely change how you view the physical ground of military history. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Cowpens, and we will catch you on the next one.